This is Camp Countdown, a Toronto Maple Leafs podcast series. I'm your host, Kyle Cushman, and on today's show, we're diving into the summer sensation that was Miroslav Holinka, the 151st overall pick by the Maple Leafs in this past summer's draft. He was the first of back-to-back picks for the Maple Leafs and was drafted out of the Osalari TreeNet system in the Czech Extraliga. He played primarily last season in the Junior League, the Under-20 League, where he was fantastic, scoring 20 goals and 41 points in 29 games, and also got into some limited action in the Extraliga, where he had 1 goal and 3 points in 16 games in the top pro league. For a player like Holinka, it is very much a situation where you look at the draft profile and it's like, hey, take the swing and we'll see what happens, because the Czech Junior League is not a league that a lot of top prospects typically play in. And looking at the history of the league and the players that it has produced in terms of draft picks, and that kind of stands out. The top Czech players at that age group aren't playing in the Junior League at that age. The players that are playing in that age, or the players that are playing at that age, are typically playing in the Extraliga full-time, not necessarily playing the full season in the Junior League. So it's a positive sign that Holinka was playing some games in the Czech Junior League, in the Czech Pro League. But let's keep in mind that the top end players that would produce at similar rates to what Holinka did would have been playing in the top level league. Like, you look over the history, Martin Necas played 1 game in his draft year in the Junior League. Yuri Kulik played 2 games at that level in his draft year. So he's more comparable to the mid-round guys in recent years that have been drafted, like Peter Hauser, who had 25 goals, 59 points in 41 games in the Czech Junior League in the 21-22 season, and scored slightly above the 1.41 points per game clip that Holinka did, just as an example there. It is very much a case where we got to see more from Holinka at higher levels, and that's what is exciting about this year and why he was a mid to late round draft pick. Obviously, if Holinka was playing the full season in the Czech League and put up decent numbers, he would not be available at 151st overall. So Holinka is coming over to North America this season. He's not remaining with TreeNets in Czechia. He's coming over to the Edmonton Oil Kings, and that's a very exciting prospect for him because he's going to be in a bigger spotlight, he's going to get more minutes, and he's going to be playing with some pretty darn good players as well. You look at the Oil Kings roster, there's players like Grayson Sachin, Florida Panthers prospect, who is oozing with skill and is kind of one of those players that a lot of people are waiting to really pop off in the WHL. He's also got a fellow Czech player on that roster, in Adam Yeko, who played last year with Edmonton and is probably a built-in opening season line mate for him. He's also going to be playing with one of the Iginla kids in Joe over in Edmonton. And if Marshall Finney doesn't end up signing a contract with the Marlies or go pro this year, he's eligible to return to the WHL and would be playing in Edmonton with a player in Holinka as well. So there's a few different intriguing aspects and ties to Holinka going to the WHL, specifically with the Oil Kings. So for Holinka, what stands out and what made him that kind of summer sensation that I mentioned off the top? Well, I don't think many, if any, people really knew much about Holinka being a mid to late round draft pick out of essentially the Czech Junior League. It's not really something that's on many people's radars unless you're really diving deep into the draft process. So coming over to development camp in the days following the draft, I think myself and a lot of people were intrigued to see at least what he looked like, because even just tracking down clips from the Under-20 League in Czechia is pretty difficult. And what immediately stood out to myself and a lot of people was just the immense skill level that Holinka has. Like, I remember there was one practice or one kind of session that he hit the ice for, and within a few seconds was doing the typical laps, specifically in the offensive zone, and picked up the puck on his blade and juggled it just the entire lap. Just like nonchalant things like that. And it translates to the game as well. It's not just kind of some fun stuff in pregame practice and whatnot. He consistently showed kind of this willingness and effort to deke players and make moves and some different fun things and quick hands that he showed off consistently in drills and then ultimately in the scrimmage as well. He loves a little outside inside move trying to beat defenders. And in the coming days, I'll post the highlights that the Edmonton Oil Kings shared after he signed with their team. And you're going to see a lot of those kind of moves. He scored a couple of goals in the Dev Camp scrimmage as well, which really got people's attention. And overall, just kind of went from a player that nobody really knew the name of to at least being somebody that people were talking about and making some noise at development camp. And when you're talking about players drafted literally in the days previous to development camp, going into that kind of camp, that's really all you can ask for, is to show well, make people talk about you, and get people excited going into this upcoming season. Had a couple of good plays in the prospect showdown over the weekend against Montreal. I didn't really catch too much of it. I was busy both days. So I kind of caught bits and pieces of the showdown. And so I saw a couple clips of Holinka making some nice plays, but I didn't really see enough to kind of make a full judgment on his performance over the entire weekend. For Holinka, this upcoming season is a really exciting one. As I mentioned, coming to the Oil Kings. He's also a November 2005 birthday, so he's a little bit on the older side of the draft class, which also means that this will be the last year he's eligible to play in the World Junior Hockey Championships. And he is very likely to be on the Czech national team this year. He played at a bunch of different U20 events over the previous year based in Europe. He didn't play at the World Juniors or anything like that, but being the kind of high skill, exciting offensive player that he is, fits very nicely into a Czech team that projects to be really good defensively and maybe needs that offensive boost from a player like Holinka could provide. Looking at some carryovers from the Czech junior team last year in December and January, Michael Hrabal, the big goaltender from the Utah system, will be back in net. He's a 2005 birthday. This will be his last World Juniors. He's going to be one of the top goaltenders at the event. Edward Shala, a first-round pick of the Seattle Kraken, who had a really disappointing season in the OHL. He's going to be looking for a big bounce-back campaign, and if he has that bounce-back campaign, could be one of the top wingers to potentially pair with Holinka, given the offensive skill of both players. They've also got a draft pick of the St. Louis Blues and Jakob Stansel returning to this roster, and probably most importantly, Adam Jiricek, hopefully healthy and ready to go by the time the World Juniors roll around on the back end as a high, or I shouldn't say high, a mid first round pick this past year for the St. Louis Blues. They've also got Thomas Galvis returning on the back end, somebody that probably should have been drafted in at least the 6th or 7th round as an undersized but really fun skating offensive defenseman. And looking at draft picks from Czechia this past year, this past summer, you've also got guys like Dominik Bedinka that are going to be on the back end of this roster. You have players like Andre Koch, who are going to be mixing in another St. Louis draft pick on the forward ranks. And even if, say, Hrabal struggles, you have somebody like Jakub Molota, who was a draft pick this year, who is going to be on the roster as well. There's a lot of intriguing pieces on this team, and I think especially the combination of Jiricek, Bedinka, Galvis, and Hrabal and net give you that really kind of high-end defensive structure with a little bit of offense coming from the back end as well. And for Czechia, the question will be what they can get offensively. And I think Holinka is somebody that could really benefit from that. He gets some big minutes at the World Juniors and make some noise, given, as I mentioned, the skill and offensive ability that he showcased, at least against his peers at this age group. Czechia will be in Group B, playing against Sweden, Slovakia, Switzerland, and Kazakhstan. So they've got a really good chance to be a top 2 seed and maybe even challenge for the top seed in Group B and look to cross over against a team like Finland or Latvia. And if they are kind of the 3 seed, then would be crossing over against USA or Canada. So it shapes up to be an exciting tournament for Czechia this upcoming World Juniors, which will be in Ottawa as well, which will be very exciting for kind of Ontario fans to get a chance to see Holinka in either actually at the building in Ottawa or in just kind of primetime slots rather than some European tournaments where you might not check out as many non-Canadian games, with those being in the morning or early afternoon. So for Holinka, a very fun draft pick, I think, is what a lot of people would describe this pick, as I'm excited to see what he does this upcoming season. He's a noted Alan Walsh client. He's one of those Czech guys that Walsh represents, and he's coming over to North America. And given his age, he's a 2005 birth date. If he has a big season in the Western League, he could be playing for the Marlies as soon as next season. Now, that might be a bit of an accelerated timeline. We could see Holinka return to Europe after the season in the WHL rather than return for an overage season in that league. There's a few things that could play out down the road, which is getting ahead of ourselves. But ultimately, looking at this upcoming season, you're looking at a fun offensive player who's also added some size over the summer. At the draft, he was listed at 6'1", 185 at the Maple Leafs training camp, and the official updated listings and such that they have to commence training camp. Holinka was actually listed at 6'2", which not bad for an 18-year-old, and 188 pounds. So a little bit bigger than what he was listed at as recently as June, July for the draft. So that's a bit of an exciting thing as well. Definitely isn't one of those small skill players. He has some size to him and has that kind of projectable frame. And we'll kind of see how things progress this upcoming season. He's definitely a player that I'm very excited to watch this year with the Oil Kings. And I think he's going to at least have some pretty fun highlights this upcoming season. So let's dive more into Holinka's game. And I couldn't think of a better guest to have on the show than Will Scouch, one of the best draft analysts in the public space, who recently has been going through every single draft class and prospect system in the NHL and had a lot of great things to say about Holinka in terms of his upside and kind of the fun direction the Leafs went in selecting him in his video about the Leafs draft. So let's get to that conversation now with Will Scouch about Maple Leafs draft pick Miroslav Holinka. Very excited to welcome onto the show Will Scouch. Will, thanks for taking the time today.
Thanks, Kyle. It's great to be here. How are you doing?
Doing well. Any day that we're talking about Miroslav Holinka is a good day.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
I
bet.
Yeah, absolutely. A very fun, as you described it, fifth round pick for the Maple Leafs this summer. I guess that's maybe the way that we can start off with. In kind of your post-draft content coverage, you described the pick as a fun direction for the Leafs to go in that kind of middle to late round of the draft. What makes the Holinka pick such a fun direction for the Leafs to go in?
I mean, he's a player that I watched off and on last year and was sort of in the back of my mind whenever I would catch the Czech national team and he was playing. It was just like he's a player that definitely stuck out on that team as a definite player that leads with a lot of skill. Like that was the thing that I took away with him, is that, you know, he was a little lanky at the time. He's filled out a little bit since, but you could definitely tell that there was something there. I largely also watched him at the pro level in Czech last year. And so there definitely was that showcase of skill and problem solving and sort of small area, you know, figuring things out under pressure, which you definitely need for the NHL. So, you know, I was pleasantly surprised to see him drafted. I was, and I'm really excited to see where his career goes, because he's a player that I think has a lot of potential and some good upside.
Yeah, the part you mentioned there is fascinating for me. The Czech men's league versus the Czech junior league. That's a huge jump for players to make, and obviously puts up really gaudy point totals: the 20 goals, 41 points in the junior league, and then has the 3 points in 16 games at the men's junior league. I guess this is less specifically about Holinka, but how difficult is it to make those kind of judgments when you're scouting players at two significantly different levels over the course of one season?
So the Czech Junior League is kind of a level where I don't really think about it a whole lot. Like the players who have been drafted out of the Junior League there, who largely are quite dominant without a whole lot of men's league experience, are generally players that you need to dig in pretty deep on them to really figure out what's going on. Like a lot of them I've seen over the years have basically turned out to be solid Czech Pro League players after 5 years, and that's not quite NHL level. But I think Holinka, you know, when you do play men's league hockey, I mean, in Europe generally, they don't play you in men's league hockey unless they think you can hang. And so for him, you know, and the Czech league is not a joke, right? Like it's a strong league, it's a physical league, it's pretty quick. And so for me with Holinka, it was, you know, yeah, you look at his point totals and he's got 3 points in 16 games last year, and he did play decent minutes. It's not like he was playing 3 minutes a night, but I think that for him, it's a lot of like, you see flashes and moments of where his game maybe could go. that definitely would benefit him more at the men's level and help him be a little more productive, because I do think he does lean more in the offensive direction than the two-way sort of defensive direction whenever I've seen him. But again, yeah, but he does have those sort of pro level habits on the ice where it's just like, if you're under pressure or something, find a way out of it somehow. He can draw pressure in, make a play. He can navigate through tight spaces and sort of doesn't really shy away from pressure. So it's just going to be a matter of where he goes from here. But you definitely see why he might be a little bit beyond the typical sort of dominant Czech junior player.
And so going back to kind of the beginning of this cycle, when did Holinka first kind of pop up on your radar as somebody to check out in that Czech league?
Yeah, I mean, generally anytime any junior aged player plays in a European Pro League, I check them out at least. For him, I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe it was an international game last year that I watched. I may have been watching someone else on the Czech team, or maybe an NTDP guy or something like that, because they played each other. Well, I guess he wouldn't have played the NTDP. Regardless, he's some level of international hockey, and I think I remember jotting his name down, seeing him, flash some of that skill. Anytime you see quick hands like that, where he can just, drag a guy in and get right through him or get around them, and the way that he does it, I think it's worth noting and exploring more. Obviously, the point totals also stick out, but the fact that he was playing pro level hockey and playing decent minutes, that was also something where I sort of went, okay, I'll take a deeper look at this guy. And I definitely think, like I've said this a number of times, and you mentioned it at the top, but it's like, if we're thinking about drafting players who are just a lot of fun and bring a lot of potential, he would have been on my list if that's what the name of the game was. And so to see him get drafted, I'm not surprised, and to see him be a mid late round sort of swing, and you leave him in Czech Republic, or he's coming to Edmonton this year, but you let him develop and you see where he goes. I feel like he'll be a good CHL player, and a productive one. So yeah, I mean, I thought that was a really nice surprise, and so for me, he wasn't on my list at the end of the year, but he flirted with it here and there over the course of the season. But in terms of just raw skill and potential, he's definitely one of those guys that I would have thrown out there as a late round guy.
Yeah, we've mentioned the skill quite a bit so far. And so when Holinka hits the ice for your favorite team, whether it be this upcoming season with Edmonton, last year in the Czech League, what are some of the things that are typically things that you see out of his game? What are the things that people can expect when they watch Miroslav Holinka on the ice?
Yeah, I mean, with the Oil Kings, I would fully expect him to be a very sort of offensive leaning, skill first guy. Like, he's a guy who I think will have no problem getting around defenses in the CHL. And I think that the other thing that he does really well too is some good give and goes. Like, if he spots a situation where he probably won't be able to get through it, sometimes he does skate himself directly into it, but he'll find a way to chip the puck past a player to a teammate, or cross ice pass to a guy for a give and go kind of thing. Like that's in his wheelhouse as well. So I would expect him to be a good CHL player. I don't know if he'll be a tremendously dominant one. I think he has the skill level and the ability to, again, get through defenses where anything might be possible. I think Edmonton is a team that's sort of on the upswing a little bit. And especially because he is a 2005 born, he's got a little more experience against older competition. And the pro experience, I think, factors in a lot. The WHL is physical as well, like the Czech Pro League. So we'll see how much of an adjustment that might be. But I have decently high expectations for a player like him as an offensive guy at the CHL level. And from there, time will tell, right? I think we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that kind of experience against pro level competition helping him making the adjustment to the WHL, because the first time that I got to see him was at development camp, and at that event, and basically the few days after he was drafted, which is a whirlwind time for a player.
Yeah.
Haley
Yeah.
Wickenheiser mentioned that he was a standout at that development camp, and she could tell that he had experience playing professional games against men,
Mhm.
just based off of some of the things that he showcased at that development camp. And so the thing that obviously we've talked about it a bunch is the skill level that stood out to me at development camp. I remember there was one start to a practice where he just juggled the puck basically an entire lap around the rink, and I'm like, holy, who is this kid? And then just the simple like dekes and slick moves that he would pull off in either drills or mini scrimmages or whatever it is. What is it that stands out to you most about his skill level watching the game tape last year over in Europe?
His hands are just really quick. Like that's the thing that I always notice. It's one thing to, use a skill move like just letting the puck go between a guy's legs and you get around them with your body, but he's a guy who will just use his hands and his stick to just dangle you, right? Like he's a guy who will fake one way, quickly cut another way, use quick hands to sort of get around pressure and everything. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And I think finding that balance point is going to be a key for him at higher levels. But I mean, in terms of just the pure, raw, just fun factor skill level to leading with his hands and sort of that fancy puck handling, it's quick. Like that's the thing, is it's not necessarily the number of times that he's juggling the puck around a player. It's just one quick skill move and he can get through you, right? So it's like that kind of quickness in that realm of skill that I think really helps him stand out.
Yeah, the right shot center has quickly become one of the more coveted kind of specific roles in hockey and in the NHL. He is that right shot center as it stands. He has a pretty good frame as well at 6'1". This isn't like some small undersized kid that has that fun dimension in Europe, but is still very much a long shot prospect in terms of the size element of it. With his frame skill set, some elements like that, is he somebody that you project as a center long term at this point of his development?
It's hard to say. I'm not totally sure about that. I think that I think when I watched him last year, you really with him, you don't want to get too carried away thinking about the offense and the skill level and all of that because that's not the whole game. For me, it depends on what you want out of your centers, right? Like I think a bit of an issue for him is when the pace of play gets ratcheted up quite a bit, and like he kind of got neutralized a little bit at that pro level because he didn't really have that escape speed, that escape quickness. He hasn't quite filled out physically yet, so that was also a bit of a tough area. But at the end of the day, like it felt as though a lot of his instincts were in the right direction. He's positioned well around the ice. I think he doesn't overstep what his responsibilities are, really. So I think that works for his benefit, especially if you want him to be a center. But I do wonder about keeping up with the flow of play at higher levels, and how important that is for a center. You got to be a great skater. You have to be able to get up and down the ice really well. And being a physical, resilient guy also helps, but definitely the sort of up and down the ice ability at the high levels are going to be a thing to work on for him, I think. But nothing says that it's impossible, right? I think at the end of the day, he's a fifth round pick. He's a little bit on the older side of a first time draft eligible, but there's nothing wrong with that. And so you've got the long time. You got a long time with him. You got a few years to really watch him develop and see where he goes. And I think that if things snowball and sort of improve, then I could see him maybe being a center. But is he going to be that top six center in the NHL? I don't. I think that's a long shot. But a third line guy who is smart enough and can chip in with some great skill, then maybe there's something there. I think he's got a lot of potential, but I think there is a bit of a ways to get there for him.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier the potential element of it, and if it was solely focused on the upside or potential of the player, he would have been one of those players that snuck onto your list. Ultimately, he didn't at the end of the draft cycle. So what were some of the concerns that you had in his game at the end of the draft cycle that made you hesitant to ultimately put him on your final list?
So I see him leaning a little more offensively, and that's step one. Is like, what do I think this guy is really at his best, right? Like, and so for me, if I see a player who leans offensively, leads with skill, leads with the things that are very difficult to do in the NHL, you gotta see really, really strong fundamentals to me to make it easier to project a guy to that level. I mean, again, don't get me wrong. I have a lot of fun watching Miroslav Holinka play hockey. He is definitely one of the more skilled, fast hands type players that I didn't have ranked. And he was on my list for a little bit last year. But it's just a matter of like, where do you set your bar of likelihood of making the NHL, right? Like I sort of have a pretty hard cutoff in my mind when I'm putting together my final lists of guys. I'm going, okay, who do I feel relatively confident can every single night play a job in the NHL? And with Holinka, I sort of thought, well, he's an offensive dude. He's got a lot of skill, but it a lot sort of depends on how he develops from here, both physically and in terms of the speed of his game. I just felt like there was something missing there that some other players had that kind of interested me a little bit more. Like he's not a player that struck me as a player where, yeah, I could see him maybe being a second line scorer, but if he doesn't, I could easily see him fall back and be a physical, sort of intense bottom six guy, right? That can go over the boards and a coach tells him to do a job and he'll do it, right? Like I don't know if I see that out of him as he is. Could he get there? Sure. I can't say it's impossible, but that's kind of what kind of kept him off the list for me. I've probably had less fun players put on my list than him, but a lot of them are more physically developed and maybe guys that I could see playing some sort of energy role or some sort of like a little pest role, just something that NHL teams need something of that you could probably get in the late rounds. And so with Holinka, it's a swing on skill, and I always love that too. I support the pick. If his name came up at that pick and I was working for the Leafs, I'm not saying no. I get it. So I see why they did it, and I definitely have been a fan of his. But yeah, there were definitely some things that just slightly knocked him down a little bit for me.
Yeah, the skill level is what kind of created some buzz for him after
Yeah.
development camp, and has definitely made him a name that more people know than probably should as a fifth round pick only a couple months ago out of like the Czech Junior League, essentially. Like it is very much a situation where, yeah, the skill level is fun, but also let's keep in mind that this is essentially a late round pick for a
Yeah.
kid that has played 16 pro games. And so it'll be fun to see how he transitions to the WHL this year. But as you mentioned, there's still very much a long way to go. As fun as a player as he's already showcased in a Maple Leafs jersey in the little time that he's been in the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Looking now to what he is as a player right now, we've talked a lot about the skill, and I assume that's kind of the standout trait for him. But what are kind of the standout or best traits of Holinka's game?
I mean, I think it's a very well balanced offensive game as well. Like I've seen him at the junior level just be able to gain that extra step of space on guys, and he can use the puck. He's 6'1", he's not small, and I think he uses his reach pretty well to protect the puck as well. And I think that gives him more tools in the toolbox to help him generate offense. But I also see some really nice vision out of him, like the way he sees the ice. And there are, like I really value when you watch pro level hockey, I really value those guys who don't just eat the puck along the boards, right? They don't just accept pressure, pin it against the boards, and cause a 50-50 puck battle, right? Like I prefer, especially at the men's level, seeing guys who can spot options, who can, see guys coming and go, okay, how am I going to get through this? And how am I going to move this play in the positive direction and not have to, put in a whole lot of work battling along the boards? Can I avoid that situation in the first place? And so I see him doing things like, when he is cutting up the boards, seeing pressure on coming, finding a line mate streaking up the middle of the ice, right? Like finding those little pockets of space to place pucks. Especially at the junior level. I saw a couple of games of him last week while we were preparing for this, just at an under 20 tournament or like a friend like an exhibition tournament this summer, and he just had that sort of really nice touch with the puck where he could spot guys and spot where to place the puck in transition and getting pucks into the offensive zone. If he's got strong line mate support, guys who can find open ice and skate into it really well, he's able to find them. So there's a lot of good, well-rounded offensive tools there for him that he can definitely work on, and he'll get the chance to do that with Edmonton. I feel like he'll play a lot of minutes with the Oil Kings this year, assuming he earns it, but I have no doubt that he will at least be an impact player in some way. So yeah, I think he brings, it isn't just about, oh, he can shoot the puck really hard and that's what he leads with. It's like how it's that next step of, yeah, you're skilled, but how do you use it, right? Like, do you use it to your benefit or do you just use it because you have it? And for him, I see a lot of both, arguably, but I definitely see more of the first, where there's always a purpose, right? Protecting the puck, getting through pressure, creating a lane to find a line mate, all those little things that definitely you need the skill to do. and it's how you want to see your skilled players utilizing it. So I think that that's a really great foundation to build on for him. And time will tell again, right? Like it'll all come down to how quick he can get, how physically resilient he can be, and how he learns how to balance all of this, right? Like balancing when to use that skill, when not to, when to keep it simple, when to sort of challenge guys and what he's capable of.
I'm glad you mentioned that summer tournament because what a crazy few months it must be for somebody in
Yeah.
his shoes. Like you get drafted, so you fly. I assume he was based in Czech for the draft, and so you come over to Toronto. You get that experience the week after being drafted. You go back to Europe. You play in a few tournaments with some of your U20 buddies on the Czech team. You come back to North America, or you sign with WHL Edmonton in there as well. You come
Yeah.
back to North America. You play a couple scrimmage stuff in Toronto. Then you go and play in front of 18,000 people at Bell Center. And it's
Yeah.
like, what a few months for
Yeah.
these kids. It's really is something that we kind of forget how hectic this time of their lives and kind of careers are after being drafted. It really is this
Mm-hmm.
insane whirlwind of a few months. And so on the flip side of the standout qualities of Holinka, what are the biggest areas that he still needs to improve on and develop upon to eventually become an NHLer if he ever does reach that point?
Yeah, I mean, to play his style of play in the NHL as he is now is really hard. Like to be a player that leads with skill in the NHL. I've been at this and watching a lot of hockey for now 5 or 6 years, like a lot of hockey, and watching a lot of these high production junior players with a lot of skill and seeing them develop and seeing them evolve has been really fascinating, right? And so when I see players like this, I go, I could see this player working out in Europe, no problem. I feel like you have these really high skill guys who get drafted and maybe get to the AHL and maybe just can't crack the NHL. And it's just because the physicality and the speed of the NHL is kind of on an island on its own. It's very difficult to know, in my opinion, it's very difficult to know when a player is ready for that and able to put in a good, a
Yeah,
successful
it's
effort
very
every night.
difficult to replicate as well, right?
Yeah,
It's something where you kind of have to see it at that level before
exactly.
you ever get that kind of knowledge or experience.
Yeah. So with me, I think the thing that kind of is a bit hesitant on this for me with him is that the speed of play, right? Like everything happens really quickly in the NHL. You got to move the puck quickly, you got to move yourself quickly, you got to shoot the puck quickly. Everything's got to happen quickly if you want success. And I feel like in the future that's only going to get more difficult as players get faster and stronger and more skilled. So as a player that leads with skill, as a player where that quickness with his hands is the sort of trademark area of his game, which I think it is right now, there's a lot that needs to build around that to get there. And I find that, and it's not true with everybody, but I find in general that everybody kind of remains a similar style of player when they're drafted and for the next few years, but they all kind of get a little better at slightly different rates, right? Like when you see a guy who plays a certain way when they're 17, generally at 23-ish, they're not that much of a different style of player. Maybe the team that drafts them ends up getting rid of them because it's not working and they go somewhere else, and somewhere else goes, hey, we think you can do this, so if you do this, we'll give you an opportunity. And they go, okay, and then they go and do it. But on the other side of the coin, it's there's just with a player like him, it's difficult to find offensive success in the NHL. And with the pace of play that he has now, I don't think there's that like fallback of maybe he's a bottom six guy. It's got to be like, let's take our time. I don't expect him to be an NHL player, if at all, for a number of years. Like it'll take some time to get there. But I think that you can build around. I'd rather have a player that has a really good trademark area than a player where you're kind of trying to develop that into a player, right? Like you have a really skilled player who knows how to score, he can set up a play, he's got pro experience, and you've got patience. I think drafting European players past the first couple of rounds makes all the sense in the world because you got a really long runway and you don't have to think about signing him until he's 22, right? So I think that's a huge benefit, and I think that if you have a player that leads with skill like this, you definitely have a nice blank slate to work with, and with a good development staff, who knows? There could be a number of routes for him.
Yeah, and as we start to wrap up here, going to WHL Edmonton this year. Going to have some fun players to play with. You think of Grayson Sachin. He's going to have a Czech teammate there as well, and Adam Yeko. Going to be a big year. He's a good candidate for the Czech World Junior team as well in December. What do you think a successful season for Miroslav Holinka looks like this year, coming to North America and kind of getting some of those opportunities to shine in a league that's going to have a bit more spotlight for some fans than if he was remaining over in Europe? I'm sure we're going to see a handful of highlights over the year that are going to get some buzz, but what do you think a successful year for Holinka looks like this year?
I mean, I have a relatively high bar for a player like him in the WHL. I think he'll get a lot of minutes. I think the Oil Kings are a great spot to go if you're a European because they're owned by the Oilers organization. They have all the resources in the world that a lot of WHL teams might not have access to. So it's a great learning environment. It's a great development environment considering the scale of the WHL right now, or where everyone's at. But I also would say, like, you see the point totals at the junior level in Czech last year, and I wouldn't expect that kind of output. Like it's a different world over here, and the Czech Junior League is very, very different to North America, or to Canada, I should say. But I would expect him, especially being an 05, he's a little bit older, so to speak. I would expect something solid. I expect him to be one of the higher scoring players on the team, right there with a guy like Yeko, and a guy who definitely, I think you're right. I forgot, honestly, that Adam Yeko was on that team because this summer's been crazy. But yeah, I mean, I think that those two guys also can work off of each other really well if they do want to end up playing together. And so, yeah, I think I would expect him to be one of the higher end offensive guys on that team. Plenty of point production, and definitely, like you said, there's going to be highlights here and there of some really, really nice moments out of him. But the at the end of the day, we're thinking about the NHL, and it's a bit of a road. But again, I feel like at the junior level in Canada, he should have a little bit of fun, at least. At the very least, have a little fun.
Fun is the name of the game, especially for
100%.
Those mid to late round picks. And Miroslav Holinka is exactly that. Well, thanks for taking the time today. Let everybody know where we can find your work and plug anything if you'd like to as well.
Yeah, of course. So you can check me out at a number of places. You can follow me on Twitter or YouTube at Scouching. Just Google it and it'll pop up. Scouching.ca as well. I operate that website where you can get a subscription, and there's tons of data tables, and you can look at my rankings and tons of visualization tools you can play around with for draft eligible prospect data, as well as players already who have been drafted. You can keep track of how your favorite team is doing. There's also, you can check me out at fractalhockey.com, which we generally help out with organizations, both on the business side and hockey side, if they have any needs with regards to that, whether it's import slots in Europe or scouting the CHL or what have you. So there's plenty of stuff over there as well. And then I write for Puck Preps as well for the 2007 age group this year. So we'll have a lot more USHL coverage over there. As well as the other areas where players are bound for college in the U.S. It's a lot of college focus. So if you like that kind of thing, you can check out Puck Preps as well and get subscribed.
Yeah, if you like the draft process, if you like prospects at all, and you're not subscribed or following well, you're doing it wrong. Well, thanks for taking the time today.
Thanks, Kyle. It was great.
Thanks again to Will for jumping on the show, and be sure to subscribe and follow him on YouTube and on Twitter. His content is fantastic. I've followed his content for years in this space, and he's one of the best if you really like diving into some of the analytics and such regarding prospects and kind of the upcoming draft class as well. That's going to do it for today's edition of Camp Countdown. Be sure to tune in tomorrow for more great stuff coming up on the series. We'll see you then.